Hey, Eric. Hey, Claire. Hey, Shelby. You guys hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you. Hello.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm home. The kids are at school. It's quiet. The dog's sleeping behind me. It's good. It's a good day.
Where's your husband?
Oh, he's at the hospital. He works at the hospital.
Oh, what does he do?
He's the infrastructure network director. So he's the guy in charge of connecting the UVM Health Network to CVPH, to Elizabethtown Hospital and Ticonderoga. He does all the computers, behind the scenes computer things that I don't understand.
Cool.
Yeah. I think his job got more important as COVID hit and everybody had to go remote.
Yeah.
Hey, Ed.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. Hey, Edgeman. There's no Excel today. You guys must be excited. Don't forget to sign up for your advising. It's coming up next week. I think we begin starting to do the virtual advising. Hey, Naomi.
Hello, how are you?
Pretty good. Hard to believe we're at midterm already. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer and see if we get a couple more people. Hey, Andrea. Hey, Paige. You guys have any questions for me while we're waiting?
I'm all good.
Sounds good to me.
When are we gonna know the grades for the poster project we did?
Oh, the tree one?
Yes.
So the forest PowerPoint that you guys did last week, all my grades should be posted in the grade book on Moodle. So I'm using the grade book. The only time you're getting stuff via email is through is when it's dealing with the lab report, where I have a bunch of comments using track changes. So hopefully you guys have been getting that feedback. If you were to go into the Moodle site to the gradebook section, all your grades should be popping up there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you guys did great. So, all right, we are almost at capacity. We have a brief lab today, so that's good for you guys to enjoy the beautiful fall day. I was just saying to the group that arrived a little bit early that we are at midterm, and starting, I think, sometime next week, your advisors should be shooting you guys messages to coordinate a time to meet up virtually to sign up for classes for next semester. I probably won't see many of you because I'm teaching the ecology class and lab. I'll be doing the lecture and lab. So hopefully everybody's doing well. Everybody seems to be doing well in the lab. And you won't need to see me again for that course, but I will also be teaching Bio 481, which is conservation biology. So, you know, we'll be talking about a lot of endangered species and ways to mitigate the losses of those species, as well as some controversial topics as well. We usually do a book reading in that class too, a book that you get to choose your own related to some conservation topic and present. So if anyone is interested, that's Bio 481. It counts in the ecology major, it counts as an elective in environmental science, and it's also in the bio major too. So if you guys are interested, you can talk to me a little bit more about it or just register. Just wanted to let you know that. So in terms of our focus today, we're gonna just be doing a brief simulation, which is kind of an all-in-one package. So you'll click on a link and it's gonna bring you to a simulator where you plug in some numbers and then answer some questions. So the assignment that's associated with today, I predict probably the best thing for you guys to do would be as soon as we hop off, because we won't be on very long, just bust it out and you can just fill in responses on the Word document and then submit it into the Dropbox and all will be good. But I want to give you a little context ahead of time. So we're going to talk a little bit about population growth, which I think you guys might have just had a test. And I know that you covered concepts like carrying capacity, exponential and logistic growth, right?
Yeah, we just had an exam on that stuff too. So.
Sweet. So it's fresh in your head, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but just wanted to give you some context. So today's work has nothing to do with the invasive earthworms, although you do have an invasive earthworm poster due towards the end of the night tonight. But it does deal with another invasive species, the lionfish. Have any of you guys seen them? Have you gone snorkeling down in the tropics or in Florida and seen these lionfish?
Yes.
Yeah, tell us more, Shelby. What are they like?
The one that I came into contact with was pretty aggressive, honestly. He kept kind of coming at me and my sister, and I mean, they were really cool. Like the one, I think, I wish I had pictures of it. But it was like all spiny looking. It was really cool.
Yeah. So I'll share screen in a sec and you'll get a chance to see it. But one thing I wanted to say is that they're becoming more and more of a nuisance down in these areas. And so there's a lot of people out there thinking about ways to reduce them. And I know maybe you guys have heard of like rattlesnake roundups down in Texas. Have you heard of those?
Yeah, it's like they basically just get paid to capture a bunch of them.
Yeah, so it's kind of the same deal in the ocean though. They're trying to reduce these invasive species populations that are exploding in number by encouraging people to harvest them and then sell them to restaurants and stuff, or just kind of fry them up and eat them. So a lot of fish tacos down in that area, you'll see that lionfish are on the menu. It's kind of an interesting way to help regulate it. You know, when you think of populations that get out of control, you probably think, I don't know about you guys, but ladybugs in my house are like crazy all over the place. And they're ladybugs, so I'm not so worried about them. But anybody else have a stink bug problem?
Yeah, back at home, they're
Yeah. And they're crazy. They're these like, you know, slow moving things, and when they're flying, you're like, oh my God, it's a hornet or a wasp, and then they land and they take forever to move. And then they have this like really pungent smell. But when these populations get out of control, it usually means that they don't have anything keeping their numbers in check. And probably what Dr. Aldred was talking about, you know, is sometimes predators are really important. Having those top predators around to eat them, you know, makes it so that you know, don't have them running amok. And that's sort of the problem with lionfish. They came in from elsewhere, and they don't have anybody that likes to eat them except humans, now that we've figured out how to hunt them. And part of the reason is their spines. So I'm going to share screen with you guys and give you an opportunity to see them if you didn't get a chance to read about them. I'm going to pop on over to our lab. You guys should be seeing the screen. I'm on dual screen, so you're like seeing the side of my face. So I'm going to scroll down to our area of population growth and invasive species lionfish. Everybody seeing that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to go over to the overview page, which again is just me typically summarizing stuff, giving you the lowdown. And here is that beautiful fish that is just not trying to be cryptic at all, right? It's kind of like, here I am, look at all my spines, you know. And if you click right here, you'll learn a little bit more about P. volitans. So if you click that read, it's going to bring you to this page that talks about what a lionfish is. And I guess they have, you know, they have this striping, I guess you could consider them to be ornate, like lions can be. And if we read a little bit more about them, you know, they're a flourishing invasive species in the southeastern US, so we'll see a map of them coming in. The big problem is that these guys tend to go into areas where there are coral reefs, so they will go in and just take over and consume a bunch of those delicate reef fish that are oftentimes in low numbers. So they can be problematic. In addition to them eating other fish, they will often kill other fish that are the ones that keep the algae down. So they're like rasping the algae. And if they're getting rid of those fish, then you can imagine there could be a lot more algae blooms if these populations get pretty high. So they're wiping out a whole group of herbivorous fish, right, that are keeping the waters more clean. So there's a couple of different species. And we usually focus on the red lionfish. If we scroll down a little bit more, they are brown and maroon. They've got these white stripes. They have these crazy fins that have rays that are sharp, and they can be problematic. So let's just take a look at this little PSA. So they'll group up like that, and they'll, you know, nothing wants to eat them because of those spines. So they're native range. They're from the Indo-Pacific area. They are in these marine habitats in the tropics. They'll be found around mangroves. I think you guys have heard a little bit about mangroves, those important aerial rooted coastal ecosystems that help in buffering against storm surge. And you'll find them in artificial reefs like shipwrecks and so on. Their role, these are top predators, right? They're going to go after, and they've got those fins that help in like cornering their prey. So it's really hard to escape them once you are near them. They're nocturnal hunters, and they were brought in, what is thought to be brought in through the aquarium trade, right? So a lot of the pretty exotic aquarium fish displays that you've seen, oftentimes lionfish are in there. Sometimes, you know, they're released when people just don't want to take care of them any longer, and once you release a handful, their populations will explode. And so we'll learn a little bit about that kind of stuff today. So precautions, things to consider. We talked a little bit about, they've got these venomous spines that can, you know, cause paralysis. There's actually, I think in the video that we're gonna spend a little bit of time together watching, There's a picture that the guy shows of his finger, and it swells up with this huge blister and causes this excruciating pain. So it's really important to take precautions when you're out kind of snorkeling, scuba, with scuba gear and whatnot. And so the video that we're going to see in a sec is going to show you sort of the best way to deal with them and what to do if you were hunting them. So that's kind of an overview of these lionfish. And I wanted to show you guys the distribution map. This actually comes from like a little app that you can access. People can report their sightings of lionfish. And again, you'll see my sister's over in Houston. We went to the beach out in Galveston, so I actually wasn't aware that they were down there. So they're there, as well as in the Florida region. I was in the Florida Keys too. We went snorkeling out in the dry Tortugas, way out in the middle of the ocean there, and thankfully didn't encounter any of them. So I've got a couple videos for us. One is 26 minutes. If you're really into them, I'd say check that out. It's like a National Geographic or PBS type video. But this is one that I think is worth us spending a little bit of time on. So I want to just play this so we can learn a little bit about what people are doing to deal with these guys.
Florida's southern coast is one of the most popular dive spots in the world, home to the only tropical coral reef in the continental United States. Hundreds of species
I'm going
of
to
fish
copy it so we
live
can see
along
it
this
bigger.
reef system. But the fish here are in danger because of a foreign predator that's been devouring them: lionfish. Florida's southern coast is one of the most popular dive spots in the world, home to the only tropical coral reef in the continental United States. Hundreds of species of fish live along this reef system. But the fish here are in danger because of a foreign predator that's been devouring them: lionfish. Eric Nelson is an avid scuba diver who hunts lionfish up to 130 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean.
They can eat 90% of their body weight every day in fish. In fact, we have pictures of fish, lionfish that have been gutted, and they have 50 small fish inside of them.
Nelson and his teammates are competing in a lionfish derby off the coast of Boca Raton, Florida. It's a competition to catch as many lionfish as possible before sunset.
It's a pretty obvious spot. It's on the outside edge. It's a little cave.
The boat's captain, Paul Varian, is a commercial fisherman who's been diving these waters for 16 years.
I saw my first lionfish 7, 8 years ago, maybe. I remember going, oh, wow, what's that? That's crazy, and then now they're everywhere.
Lionfish are native to the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and there are different theories about how they came to inhabit Atlantic waters. The leading theory is that a few home aquarium owners set some lionfish free in the ocean in the 1980s, and the fish rapidly reproduced. Several scientific studies have traced the DNA for the entire lionfish population in the Atlantic back to a small group of fish. When lionfish invade a reef, they can reduce the population of fish they eat by 65% over 2 years,
That's crazy.
according to a study conducted in the Bahamas. How much of a problem are lionfish to the reefs in this area?
Diving the same reefs over and over every year, you can actually really noticeably tell the difference between a reef that had lots of reef fish before the lionfish invasion, and then devastatingly half as many reef fish.
Lionfish consume more than 100 species of fish, including baby grouper and snapper, and fish that maintain the health of the reefs by grazing on algae.
The good news is there wasn't hardly any fish down there, right?
Eric Nelson says he's noticed that the hunts off the coast of Florida are starting to make an impact.
Once we started actively hunting lionfish, we noticed that the same populations are coming back.
During the past decade, lionfish have invaded the underwater habitats in the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean. Scientists expect that the lionfish invasion will continue to spread from North Carolina to the southern tip of Brazil. One reason for the rapid lionfish invasion is that they are fast breeders, laying more than 2 million eggs every year. Lad Akins oversees the lionfish program for Reef Environmental Education Foundation that is dedicated to marine conservation.
Well, the marine environment is a very complicated, interconnected system. And it's taken thousands of years for things to work their place out in balance. And when you introduce a new piece to that puzzle, it disrupts the entire system.
Because lionfish are not native to the Atlantic, they don't have natural predators here. Akins says when you combine that with their voracious appetites, lionfish wreak havoc on underwater habitats. And lionfish have been found as deep as 1,000 feet in the ocean.
With the impacts we're seeing in our shallow waters, we don't know how bad this is going to get. So our entire marine ecosystem is at risk. We could see extinctions of some species of fish. We could see severe degradation to coral reef environments if algae is not kept in check by the grazers, which lionfish are consuming. We could see impacts to our commercial fisheries, to grouper, snapper, shrimp, crabs.
Without natural lionfish predators here, the most effective way to control the population is for divers to catch and kill them. But they're not easy to catch. They don't swim in large schools, and they have poisonous spines that can sting.
This is safe, that's safe. They also have the venom right on that one and that one, then along the pectoral there. The pain can be 50 times worse than a wasp sting. All right, so that's about an hour after being stung. That was a total of about a 3-month ordeal.
The dive community has stepped up to find safe ways to catch lionfish. One diver designed this plastic cylinder that he calls a zookeeper to store lionfish underwater and protect divers from being stung. Nelson and his team are using pole spears that he adapted and calls lionfish slayers.
What's great is that everybody is pitching in to address this. Divers are spending their time and money to go out and remove lionfish. Governments are putting money and effort into researching better tools and techniques.
Florida's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has been running a public awareness campaign about the lionfish threat and contributing prize money to derbies to catch them. As this lionfish derby comes to an end, the dive teams head back to the dock for weigh-in.
477.
Lad Akins' organization, Reef, is one of the sponsors of the event. He says derbies can help scientists better understand the species.
Every individual lionfish that's collected is measured because that information is very useful in looking at impacts and populations. And then samples are made available for researchers that are hoping to better understand lionfish.
Some fish is also donated to local restaurants to create a human appetite for lionfish. Chef Andreas Abayou at Piccolo Restaurant in Fort Lauderdale says his customers line up for tables when the specialty item is on the menu.
Grill it, saute it, bake it. It's like its flavor. It's really versatile. There is no right, there is no wrong. It's one of those fish that just is.
Favorite recipes? Lionfish tacos. And fishermen have noticed that catching lionfish can be profitable. Commercial fisherman Paul Varian says demand is increasing, and even Whole Foods sells them when available.
They've become a pretty big part of my income. But the last year or so, everybody finally figured out that the guys who buy them from us, the restaurants, the consumers, everybody likes them, and it's worth it. For, everybody's making money and the consumer's happy at the end. So now the price has gone up, demand's gone way up. I had people calling me, I don't even know who they are, begging to buy lionfish. And I'm like, sorry, I'm just supplying the people I've been selling to for years. But so if I could shoot 1,000 pounds a day, I could sell them.
As the results come in from the weigh-in at this derby, some people are tasting lionfish for the first time.
I'm a diver, and I've seen them underwater for a long time, and everybody's been telling me it's a nice, light, white, crispy fish, and a very mild flavor.
Lad Akins says popularizing lionfish cuisine may be the best way to control the problem.
Here is a fish, lionfish, that needs to be removed. So consuming lionfish is the best possible option. Eradication is not on the table. Lionfish are simply too widespread, too deep, too inaccessible in some areas for us, with our current tools and technologies, to remove every last one. So what we're left with is something akin to weeding the garden.
I don't know about you guys, but those fish tacos look pretty darn good. So yes, going back to our Moodle site, you know, there's a lot of research associated with them. I don't necessarily need you guys to read any of these associated articles, but this is an article here, if you're interested, that speaks to what their impact on a reef is to the other populations of fish on the reef. Just a graph that's from that. For, again, those of you that are interested in this topic, this is a link that speaks to them being placed on the menu. And this idea that people are often, you know, how there's, you know, piscivores, these are people that just eat fish. There's vegetarians, there's locavores that only eat local food. And there's now invasivores. There's people that will really like focus on just eating these invasive species. So anyways, if you were interested in learning more about them being put on the menu, that, you know, I have a link that is in there. I wanted to kind of scroll down here. You know, these are organized trips to hunt. We talked about them. This lionfish hysteria section, right? There's this invasivore movement. There's actually even a book called Eating Aliens, where people, you know, are learning how to do that. For our area, actually, over the summer, I took an online webinar course on wild edibles. And I don't know, have any of you guys foraged for wild edibles? Anybody? Like dandelion greens or?
Indian cucumbers are pretty popular.
Yeah. The one that really struck me, and if, I don't know if any of you guys have encountered this before, but stinging nettles, they're horrible, right? If you walk and brush up against them, it's almost like all these like glass shards have been like injected into your skin. So it really kind of feels sore. And they harvest them and then they cook them down like dandelion greens and like you would with chard and kale and stuff, and saute it, and people eat them, and they're pretty high in antioxidant and you know, all the vitamin properties that people talk about, those leafy greens. Garlic mustard is another one. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but people will harvest garlic mustard, which is another invasive plant. It has little tiny yellow flowers and it grows in these disturbed areas. They'll go out and harvest it and make pesto out of it. So they'll add some pine nuts and cheese and stuff. So anyways, just ways of thinking, you know, your population gets out of control and there's no top predator or something there to take it out and reduce its population size. Maybe humans play a role in helping to regulate that population. So I wanted to kind of let you guys know that that is there. And there's actually a whole lionfish cookbook for any of you that, you know, spend a lot of time in that area and are interested in learning more about it. But our goals for today are really to talk more about how populations grow, thinking about the trajectory of population growth in a logistic and an exponential fashion. And you're going to do that by using this interactive module. So when you click on that, it's going to bring you into this, okay? And so this is where like your homework will begin. You'll be in this module and you will be guided by this invasive lionfish assignment. So when we get off today, my recommendation would be for you guys to click on that interactive module and open this lionfish assignment, and it's going to prompt you to play around with this simulator and answer some of these questions. There's like 14 questions to answer. So, but we're gonna kind of go through it together, okay? Again, anyone interested in more stuff on the lionfish, that information is right here. So let's go back to this. And the assignment itself is right here, right? I pulled it up and basically just saying, you know, you're gonna do this assignment, submit this as a Word document. It's due in a week at the end of the day, like usual. Here's the link to the interactive simulator that I have open. And then you guys will follow these directions starting with part 1. So the first thing we need to do is read the introduction on population dynamics, and we'll click on then exploring exponential growth. So we'll go here to that simulator and we'll just read about this, right? There, it's just a little one pager, right? So these are different types of populations, right? We've got endangered populations. We can think of ones that, you know, that are in low numbers. So these are the panda. You know, we've got bald eagle used to be, but now their populations have recovered, so they've been taken off the endangered species list. California condor, same deal, that we had a lot of captive breeding and tracking of those animals, and now they have recovered. But you can imagine a lot of different species that are low in population size and are endangered. You've got other populations that are out of control, those invasive species or pest outbreaks. The stink bug that I gave as an example, mosquitoes that transmit disease at high densities. Anybody who's from south of here, you might have heard of the, oh my goodness, the spotted lanternfly. You guys seen pictures or heard of it? They're actually quite beautiful, but they, let me pull it up, but they have decimated some of the fruit trees. See how beautiful they are? Whoops, I don't know why that's like 5 million size. They are really beautiful, but then they will cover your tree like this, which is horrific. And I know that's what my significant other side of the family is dealing with down in Pennsylvania, is this outbreak of spotted lanternfly. So we've got those. We have populations of really important crop plants, right, that are usually grown as a monoculture, and the human population, right? So we're familiar with all these different types of populations, some that are on a very stable trajectory, some that are on an invasive kind of trajectory, and they're all experiencing different limitations or maybe no limitations on that population. So the first thing we were supposed to do is evaluate the exponential growth model, okay? And we can learn a little bit about mathematical models, but really we're focused on this exponential growth model, okay? And all this stuff should be familiar to you, having just taken the test and being in class with Dr. Aldred. So, right, exponential growth is typically what we see, the growth of a population that doesn't have limitation on resources. So imagine a flower beetle that finds itself all by itself with maybe just a mate in a big bag of flour or a big sack of flour, right? Unlimited resources, tons of potential to reproduce, and lots of space available to them and all the food it could possibly need to be able to reproduce, right? You can imagine their growth trajectory would be exponential, right? So to model exponential growth, right, you've probably heard of, your population growth rate, which is dn/dt, or the change in n, population size over the change in time, equals little r, which is the growth rate, the maximum per capita growth rate, times your population size, right? So this is our continuous model. And if you wanted to predict what your population size is at some time t in the future, you would just transform it into this equation, okay? So you can solve for that n at some time t, and it's equal to your initial population size n, and then multiply that by e to the r, e to the raised to the growth rate times time. So I think that you guys are familiar with these terms. This is just a visual that shows bacteria kind of dividing in an exponential fashion without any limitations. And now our job, after we read a little bit about that, is to go over here to the simulator, okay? So again, let's look at where we are on the assignment here. So once we have read through it, we're going to click on the How to Use button, and there's a gear icon, and we can make changes. We can play around with these slider tools, and we want to adjust these variables so that we can see a situation like 1, 2, and 3. So a long period of time without no growth. So the curve looks almost flat. So let's go back to that simulator and just orient ourselves. So right now we have this defaulted and set to an initial population size of 100, a growth rate of 0.6, and a time of 0, okay? So what we might do is, let's see what happens if we reduce our population size. Well, that's flat, right? If we keep our population size low, that's one way that we can get growth that is not super exponential, right? And pretty low. What if we altered our growth rate? So if we dropped our growth rate, little r, down really low, that also would give us a scenario where we have pretty flat growth, right? Not much growth, not the exponential trajectory like we expected, right? How could we then change it so that we have more growth? Well, we can crank up that growth rate. We can crank up our population size. So really, you just are expected to kind of play around with this and see, you know, how you would need to model these 3 scenarios. So we already looked at a long period of time with almost no growth, an extremely rapid growth from the very beginning, okay? That's key, from the very beginning. So again, this is really rapid growth, right? Right now our growth rate is at 0.78. We can crank that up. But super rapid growth, maybe we need to crank our initial population size up more, right? So you can play around with it, and you can think about all the ways that you can make those things happen. A long period of slow, but clearly accelerating growth with, at the end, the curve becoming more steep, right? So just jot a couple notes down, you know, like what did you need to do? Did you need to increase your big N, increase your big R, reduce one, increase the other? You know, how were you able to make that happen? So you can make a note of that on this sheet, okay? So we'll keep going a little bit farther down here. Apply those parameters from a natural population, and we're going to do this by looking at data from this particular article, Cote and Smith, which deals with the lionfish, and it's in the Caribbean, right? So they did a survey, this group did a survey in the Bahamas starting in 2004, and they originally only saw 2 individuals, okay? And now we need to run that simulator for the next few years and write down the values for the N and the values for the DNDT, or that population growth rate, okay? So let's just kind of play around with it. So the initial population size was 2, right? And in terms of how many years we want to run this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? So we can go down here. Minimum year is 0. Maximum, we want to do 5, right? And in terms of the growth rate, so we had a population size starting at 2, and the growth rate, use R of 0.95 as growth rate for these lionfish in novel habitats. So growth rate, an R of 0.95 is pretty fast. That's really fast growth rate. So let's just take a look. Okay, so 0.95, initial population size of 2, and we can run the simulator. And we can see what happens, right? We can also, now it's at 5, we could knock it down to year 2, right? And when we say year 2, which is what you need to fill in right here, right? What's the N at year 2? What's the DN dt at year 2? Your N at year 2 is 13. Your DN dt is 12.7, right? We can change it to 3, the year 3. Okay, now we jump to an N of 35. We jump to a DN dt population growth rate of 32. Okay, we do it at 4. Now we're at 89, and so on and so forth, right? So you guys can see how that would shift, and you just need to fill that information in. Okay, so that answers your question 1 when you work through that. I also want to say that as you're playing around with this and making your, making your changes here, there's a plot 2 down here that you can expand. And while you're simultaneously changing those simulator settings up here, this is also adjusting. This graph down here is also adjusting. Okay. I just wanted you to see that that was there. Okay. So the next question, question 2, how does that model estimate compare to the field data collected by that same group of authors? Okay. So you'll fill in this table, and then you're going to look down at this graph for the years 2005 to 2009. Okay, and you're going to look at your y-axis, and you're going to see if that N value, associates with it, if your values seem to follow that same trajectory. Okay, and you can just respond in a sentence or 2. Okay, and now we're just going to scroll down to the second part where we talk about logistic growth. Now, here's where I'm going to jump over to this slide right here that should be familiar to all of you guys, right? When we're talking about a population growing, we usually graph N versus time, right? And if we were thinking about those flower beetles that don't have any constraints, they have all the resources, they have no predators, the conditions are great weather-wise, we would expect their N over time to just keep skyrocketing in this direction. But what if we cut the resources in half? What if we added more flower beetles to that bag, right? We need to think about how the growth rate might change when their space is limited and their resources are limited. Maybe even we add water and half of the bag of flowers spoils and they have less resources. How does that change their potential to grow? Okay, and as you guys should know, when resources become limited or when their population size gets really high and they get crowded, they start to get aggressive, they start competing, they start behaving differently and putting that energy towards maybe fighting each other or eating different things or being active at different times to reduce competition. And they might have less energy to make babies and be able to reproduce and have a high growth rate, right? So what happens is when your population size gets crowded, it gets crowded to the point where the maximum level of crowding that you can have is your carrying capacity, right? Okay. So growth's going to be great until about halfway to carrying capacity, right? Your growth trajectory, your little r is positive, everything's great. Your maximum growth potential is right here at about halfway to K, whatever the value of K is. Say it's 100, then that would be about 50 individuals. All is good until you get to a little bit more than 50 individuals. And when you do, that's when you start feeling the effects of crowding, having less food, and you end up not being able to make as many babies, right? So growth rate starts to taper. Notice the slope, which is your growth rate, starts declining. And then when you approach carrying capacity, when your population gets close to that 100, right, or whatever it ends up being, that's when your growth is flat. And that means that R is 0, there is no more growth, your N equals your K, you're totally crowded, there's no more available resources, and your population is no longer growing. Now, if you were to take a little square and make, I'll insert it here, insert a little square right here, okay, and took the slope, which is, the rise over the run, the slope of that N over time graph right there, it is the same as right here, okay? That right here, this is a graph of growth rate as a function of population size. So when there's not many other members of your population around, you have this potential to grow really fast, rapidly, tons of resources, not crowded. As we move up our graph, right, whoops, this corresponds to right over here. Things are looking good. You're still not crowded, right? But there's more of you to mate with, so you can maximize your growth rate, right? We can then, you know, move up as more individuals are coming. Now we're at a situation where when we look at the growth rate of that population, we're at a maximum, right? Remember we talked about growth being at a half K. Once we get past that point, growth rate slows down, and it's because there's less food and more crowding, right? So right here is right here on the graph, right? Growth is now declining, not as much food, more crowding, more aggression towards each other. And then finally we end right here where your population size is at carrying capacity. And when you look at how the growth rate when you're at carrying capacity behaves, your growth rate is 0, right? There's nothing left. There's no resources and so on. And so I just wanted you to be thinking about, you know, how your population behaves as you get more and more crowded and resources become limited. Lionfish doesn't seem to be a problem right now, right? There's no limitation right now on the food that they're eating. But what happens when their numbers get so high that there's no more reef fish for them to eat? We should start seeing their numbers decline because they have less resources, right? So your job then is to think about, in this assignment, how that growth trajectory, switching from the exponential simulator to the logistics simulator, you know, playing around with that model, right? And learning about how we have to adapt our model. So it's not just growth rate times n anymore. We have to bring in that k minus n over k, right? That slowing factor that happens when you get crowded at those high population sizes. So we can go to that simulator and we can adjust our population size and we can adjust our carrying capacity up or down, and you can see how it's shifting our trajectory. And our growth rate we can reduce as well, right? So think about adding more resources. When you add more resources, it probably allows your carrying capacity to get higher. And if you reduce resources, your carrying capacity will go lower, right? So you'll address the questions here, right? So go into that model simulator, set your population size to 100, set your growth rate to 2, set the carrying capacity to 100, and set your time interval to 10, and you know, address these questions. So given that information, you know, what's the appropriate carrying capacity to include in a model for lionfish, right? So you can think about that. And over here, you know, we can look at what their data suggest, right? And carrying capacity is where things tend to flatten out. So where on this n versus time graph do we sort of see things flattening out, and follow it back over here to the range of, you know, n values that you would probably associate with a K, or a carrying capacity, right? So you'll play around with that. How does your slope change in relation to population size? You know, think about that. Slope is growth rate, right? Your slope of the graph of n versus time is your growth rate. How does that change in relation to n, population size? How does your growth rate change as you increase your population size, right? Think about that graph that I had up, right? As your population size changes from 0 to K, right? Not crowded to totally maximum crowding, right? How does your growth rate change, right? It starts off fast. Well, it starts off with a little delay because there's not very many individuals to mate with, right? But then it picks up. Then at about halfway, it's at its maximum, and then you start declining growth rate because you are crowded, right? And here, from 2004 to 2006, when the population size and density is small, and then answer this question right here, right? Is, go back and refer to 2008 to 2010. Take a look at what 2008 to 2010's trajectory looks like in the graph, and how does that compare to what your findings are, right? Which of these best explains the low population growth rate from 2004 to 2006? Answer that question. Choose all the following, accordingly address this question here. I don't want to give too much away. These are fairly straightforward questions. And then we scroll down to part 4, okay? Part 4 just has maybe 4 questions. And there is another article that they refer to here in this message. And we've got paramecia, these tiny little guys right here, that are growing in pitcher plants. If you guys have seen pitcher plants, these are those carnivorous ones that grow in these low nutrient environments, and they have to acquire other organisms and digest them to get their nutrients out, so they're no longer limited by those nutrients. So these paramecia, along with mites and other bugs and wasps and so on, are going to fall into this pitcher plant. They might be the first ones to enter into that pitcher plant, so there's nobody else in the community. There's a bunch of debris that's falling in, decaying leaves, good nutrients for these organisms to consume. Bacteria growing in the water, algae and whatnot growing in the water in that pitcher plant, all good food for them. But when the population size gets too high, they will begin to experience these different growth trajectories like we've been simulating, okay? So the results from their article are displayed right here in this graph, and these next few questions are associated with it, right? Using evidence from the bar graph above, talk about how population growth rates are affected by initial cell densities, okay? So the initial density, here, when it's low, this is what the growth rate was. As we add more individuals to that initial density, what's your feeling on how that impacts growth rate, right? That's a very simple answer in a sentence. How does resource availability affect population growth rate, right? And that's where we look at these colors, right? Low resources are the light blue, high resources are the orange. How does that play into this, right? What did it allow those populations to experience? Other than food resources, this is where we put on our thinking caps a little bit. Other than food resources, what other resources might affect protozoa, okay? They're in a pitcher plant, right? What else in the pitcher plant in terms of resources, not predators, not parasites, not competitors, but what other resources do they need to survive and be able to maximize growth potential, right? And then finally, now we'll apply these findings to the case of the lionfish. Choose a density-dependent factor that you think can affect the lionfish, and then outline an experiment that you could conduct to determine whether this factor is a limiting factor in lionfish population growth. So remember, limiting factors, things that limit these populations, I want to draw your attention, and I don't know if Dr. Aldred has this graph or this diagram, but what limits population growth, what can play into it? There's biotic and abiotic factors, right? The biotic factors are resources, obviously, living things, the organisms that they eat, or the vegetation they eat, right? Bacteria or whatever they're consuming. Predators that are around that eat them, that can regulate their population size. Competitors that are around them that can take away their own food or force them to get aggressive with, right, and use their energy that way. Parasites and disease, right, when they're at high densities, that's when disease and those sorts of things tend to spread more. So that could knock their population size. And then obviously when you get crowded, I don't know if you guys experience this too, but when your elevator that you're taking like to the, top floor of a big tall skyscraper is filled, how do you feel inside, right? Versus if it was not crowded and maybe you were going on your own. There's that internal physiological hormonal type responses that you might get when you're crowded versus when you're not. I know when organisms have lots of babies and there's a lot of stress associated with it, sometimes it reduces lactational output, right? So you can't raise the baby very well because they end up kind of starving. Sometimes you can't even get that fetus to last and develop through the entire pregnancy under stresses like this when you're at high densities and resources can be limited. There's like spontaneous abortion type stuff that will occur and the tissues get resorbed, right? So when populations are at high densities, those individual females that are reproducing, their response and their ability to be able to reproduce can be influenced by their own physiology, right? So there's those intrinsic things that can occur, but then there's also those extrinsic things that can occur, like I mentioned, with, you know, competitors, predators, disease, that sort of thing. But also weather, right? We talked a little bit about abiotic factors. That's another extrinsic factor. But imagine really deep snow, and that deep snow inhibits deer from getting over to that wintering ground, which is where the good food is, where it's a little warmer because it creates the igloo effect because there's, you know, pine trees all around you covered with snow to keep it a little warmer, and you have the good food. At a high density of deer, then not a lot of deer will be able to make it through the snow and have access to that because they're full, right? Those wintering grounds could be full. So these are all just ideas, right? But they're all things that you could kind of be thinking about in the context of what is that paramecia feeling in that pitcher plant? You know, how could I test that? And also the lionfish on the coral reefs. How can I test these sorts of things? All right, so that's it, really. And you guys just really need to go on and play around with the growth model, plug in those numbers, and be thinking about how it plays into that paramecia data set and the lionfish data set, and answer those questions for me. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Yep.
All right, so where do you drop that when all is said and done? Just again, I'm in that overview page. The interactive module is accessed right here. The assignment is accessed right here. And then when all is said and done and you finish filling that in, you guys are going to go back to the main page, and the Dropbox is right there. Okay, so feel free to drop it in there, put your name on the top. You have until the end of, you know, well, Tuesday of next week to do it. And if you have any questions, just reach out. Sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
All righty. Bye,
Thank you.
guys. Have a great week.
Bye, you too.
See ya.
Have a good day.
You too.